Today's podcast is brought to you by Visit Bloomington. In the heart of the U.S. Midwest, Bloomington, Indiana is the perfect place to host a small to mid-sized meeting, convention, or conference, offering unique and flexible venues available for groups of up to 400, as well as a hub for higher education at Indiana University, a nationally revered cultural scene, and natural wonders like the Hoosier National Forest and Monroe Lake. Bloomington is sure to wow your guests during and after their visit. Go to visitbloomington.com to start planning your next meeting. Well, hello, my name is Grant Carpenter, and I'm the Executive Director for the Indiana Society of Association Executives. In this special bonus episode of You Should Hear This, we celebrate 4 incredible seasons of the podcast. I'm joined today by hosts Nick Estrada and Chris Beaman as I reflect on the podcast journey, highlighting its most memorable moments and the impact it's had on the association industry. With more than 3,000 downloads from 56 episodes, covering topics like leadership, event planning, membership, marketing, the importance of DEI, and so much more, the podcast has become a trusted resource. This finale episode will share some behind-the-scenes stories, some lessons learned, and hope for the future for association professionals. With that, let's welcome Season 1 and 2 host Nick Estrada.
And Season 3 and 4 host Chris Beaman.
Hi, it's good to be here.
I'm so happy to be with you both. You both are friends and colleagues, so it's really fun to have this conversation with you. I really wanted to bring us all together to kind of celebrate the time and energy that you have given to this podcast over the last 4 years. As you both know, associations make hard decisions, and shuttering this podcast is certainly one of those moments. And so while I want to at least acknowledge those challenging moments, I really want to take time to celebrate the good that's come from this, and you two are certainly integral to that. So I appreciate you right off the bat for all of the time and energy that you've given to this. But I'm curious, I want to go back to the beginning. So this podcast started before I arrived on staff. And so Nick, you may have a good insight there. So let's start with you. What inspired the creation of the podcast? How did you first get involved in host?
Yeah, I mean, I think its genesis really came from the Young Professional Committee. I think when it first started, I think a lot of our conversations were more how to give something to young professionals that they could listen to, that they could gain kind of some feedback, as they're beginning their careers or their journeys in the association profession. But we quickly, I think, expanded to this really should be for everybody, right? Like this isn't just something for young professionals. Anyone who's been in the industry for a lot longer or the profession, right? Like I think can also still learn something from this. And so I think it changed from it being for young professionals to changing to it's just coming from the young professionals, right? Like we were just a group that I'm going to say like activated the podcast, right? In terms of kind of what was there. I remember even spending a long time just talking about what the podcast would be called. There was a long conversation. I don't even remember what some of the other ones at this point now were, but I remember we finally landed on You Should Hear This. Because I think, again, from like a more conversational tone, that's kind of what we were going with, right? It was like, there's some conversation that's happening and like, you should hear this, right? You should hear this topic. You should hear you should hear from these people, right? Like there's just a lot of, I think, play that we could make on that name. And so that's kind of where we got in terms of coming to fruition. In terms of becoming the host, I think it was a little of our favorite kind of thing, which was voluntold. There was a smaller group of us that kind of started to have the conversation about what we wanted to do. And I think there was a lot of excitement to develop topics. There was a lot of excitement to help figure out who speakers might be. I don't think there was a lot of excitement initially about being the first person who needed to host this. And so I think if I remember right, I think I had a conversation with Stu at some point where I was just like, look, if I'm the one that needs to do it, then fine. I'm not necessarily super excited about it either, but I also don't want this to make it seem like I want this to be about me. And he was like, I don't think anybody's worried about that. I think we just need a host. And so I think that's kind of how I fell into the first one and kind of trying to figure out then how to make it work.
And I'm so grateful you did that because during your first 2 seasons, I think the podcast and the organization learned a lot of lessons that then sort of helped me figure out how to navigate it. And, I came in later in the conversation on the Young Professionals Committee. I think my term on that committee started during a time, actually during COVID, and during some of those early conversations, I remember hearing, you know what, we should really revisit this podcast idea. We've talked about it for several years. We should just do it. And I think there's a lesson here for associations in that there are some times where you just have to do it, right? You just have to try it out, see if it's going to work. And I think, it's obvious that there's a bit of sadness that goes along with sunsetting this podcast, that we've invested our time and energy into, but it's also an important lesson for us that we let things run their course, and we know when it's time to sunset them, and now's that time. And I think, I remember those early conversations of us just saying, like, what is keeping us from doing this? We identified the barriers, we tackled them, and we gave it a whirl. And it's something I think that ISAE should be really proud of.
Yeah, I agree. It's been fun to have the project inherited. You look now at the association podcast landscape, and there's so many of them. There's lists all the time. Our fellow state societies, like Texas, has a big podcast. And so it's so fun to see that it's burgeoning. Now it creates competition, which can be good or bad, but it has been really cool to see. What I think is really funny is that it came from the young professionals group. And I don't know whether that's a thing that just podcasts are for young people, but then it became a challenge at some point for finding finding guests, because young professionals inherently didn't know that many people. And so I think it was really helpful when we began to broaden the scope, and Chris, you were certainly able to help with that with an ASAE lens of bringing in some national people. But it was interesting to see that came from the young professional group. So I just love, Chris, your anecdote of like, just get the thing started and see what happens. Because that really seems like what happened here. So I want to ask both of you, Chris, I'll start with you. What was one topic or conversation that stood out as the most meaningful, or maybe what was one fun guest that was especially fun to work with?
So I love this question. I really took the role of being host more seriously than I thought you all probably anticipated when you asked me to be host. But I spent a lot of time really thinking about what's trending in associations, what do young professionals and/or mid-career professionals need to hear about our work, what do they want to hear about, what are ISAE members saying, are topics of interest to them, things that are challenges in their day-to-day, work. And I took it very seriously to line up guests that were bringing diverse perspectives. And, one of my favorites was with Tony Brealey from ASAE, the Australasian Society of Association Executives. She had given a panel at one of the ASAE annual meetings. I think it was in Atlanta. Anyway, and it was on international etiquette blunders to avoid. And now keep in mind, I've lived in Indiana my whole life, 35 years. I do travel quite a bit, but I have not been outside the United States. And so but Sigma, my organization, has international events that I knew, down the road I might be traveling to. And so the topic was obviously of interest to me. And some of the things that she mentioned during the panel and then the subsequent podcast that we hosted were fascinating to me. Things that I had never thought about. Again, I'm in a small Indiana bubble, in a small even a small United States bubble, and it just made me think about some of the cultural norms that we don't even realize that we do in day-to-day life and how that might be perceived internationally. Frankly, it started to make me question like everything I said or did, which wasn't really the point, but I don't know, that was just and it's hard to pick that one because I had so many incredible conversations. We brought on someone who was transgender to talk about inclusion in associations. We had Leslie on talking about the world of AMCs, which was foreign to me, navigating from industry to association, which a lot of people do. And there were so many things that we talked about that were incredible, but I think that was probably my favorite one. And there were quite a few laughs on that as well.
I think Chris brings up a really interesting perspective on that in terms of like, as a host, I think one unique thing was that I feel like I got to learn a lot, right? Like these were people that I don't know that I probably would have had a chance to speak with in any other setting or to talk about the specific topic, right? Like I may have interacted with some of these people, right? Obviously we got hosts from ISAE volunteers and, some other kind of adjacent spaces that maybe I'd seen them or I'd had a maybe generic conversation with them, but the ability to actually talk with some of these individuals on what is really their area of expertise was just very interesting. And I found myself often, I don't know, Chris, if you had this, but there were a lot of times where I'd be like, okay, I'm writing down questions. Is this really a question that like the audience is interested in, or like, do I just want to know? Right.
Oh yeah, for sure. That happened a lot.
Like, this is just a question that I'm going to throw in because I'm genuinely curious. and maybe it's a little narcissism, but I'd be like, if I'm curious, that maybe somebody else must be as well, right? So I'm gonna learn that a little bit too.
Well, and Grant, to your, you had mentioned earlier, we started bringing on some more national folks, and I think my intention really was to two things. One, really help bring more national perspectives. ASAE has not been in Indiana since I've known about ASAE annual meeting, and I'm so excited it'll be here in 2026. And so, my goal was to really bring sort of national voices and perspectives into, recognizing this was a podcast for the Indiana Society of Association Executives, but I also was very intentional to balance that with the talent that we have in Indiana. We have some amazing people. We've got Leah York, we've got Sean Ballard and Jessica McMillan and Nick. I think, excuse me, you were on the podcast once, and Talby from Willow Marketing and Kelby, like all of these incredible, Leslie Murphy, like all of this incredible talent in Indiana. And it was kind of tricky to balance that, right? I mean, just trying to make sure that we're having voices from a variety of perspectives, but it was also a really fun challenge.
Yeah, that would be very cool to have those type of conversations. Nick, you had mentioned that you're probably not going to have anyway, unless it worked with the podcast being a conduit for those conversations. Is there one, Nick, for you that stood out as the most impactful, the most fun that you had on an episode?
I mean, I think a couple. I was actually just scrolling through, right? Because I'm like, I mean, at some level, it's been so long. I mean, I will not lie. Even the other day when I was thinking, I was like, we haven't done 4 seasons of this. And then I was like, oh, dang, we have done 4 seasons of this. That's crazy. I will say, I think just a personally exciting one for me, we did a podcast with Michelle Mason very at the beginning, I think, of her time at ASAE. She was kind of still doing I think she was calling it like her road show. She was traveling around and she was talking and listening, or it was her listening tour, maybe, I think is what she was calling it. But I felt very honored to be able to get her onto the podcast so early on in that process. And again, it's not a conversation that I probably would have ever had with Michelle in any other kind of scenario, right? And obviously we leveraged ISEE's connection with ASAE to make that happen. But I think that was just really exciting. I think it helped to provide what I felt like was some legitimacy for early on in our podcast, that like, not only are we having these conversations, but wow, like look at this guest that we were able to bring on. And then I think, again, a big one for me was starting to hit a little bit of kind of just trends within the industry. And so I think trends within the industry were hit on a variety of topics. But again, kind of a larger national voice that was an exciting opportunity for me to speak with was Lowell Applebaum. I think a lot of folks know his name. It's just somebody that, again, I don't feel like I would typically probably be able to get like a one-on-one, 1-hour conversation with. But that was really exciting. And I think to understand the way in which he viewed associations and the things that he's looking at and was kind of building out his own kind of perspective, I think, that was just a really intriguing opportunity, I think, to kind of get that conversation going.
And Grant, I know we have other questions and conversation to get to, but I wanted to mention too, I think one of the cool things that I saw early on when Nick was hosting the podcast is he hosted Brandon Craig and Alicia S. I'm not going to even try to pronounce her last name on imposter syndrome. And I knew Nick and I had done the ASAE Next Gen Summit together, and I saw how he took a relationship, a connection formed at an ASAE program or event, and brought it home using that network. And I just thought that was so cool. And that's, Nick, frankly, that's one of the things that inspired me to continue doing the same was, how do I leverage my network or my peers' network, groups that I've been fortunate to be a part of, and bring that to our peers and colleagues here in Indiana.
Yeah, I think that's so cool. And sitting in the exec chair to know that we had ASAE famous people on our podcast is really cool. I mean, Michelle Mason and Lowell Applebaum. I mean, I was just at a conference and saw Michelle, walk by. I was going, Michelle Mason. And to have some of that for our Little Indiana podcast, which has done great stuff in Indiana. ISAE is a remarkable organization for what we do, but to have that scope is really cool through those relationships that you've built. So we've talked about guests, so let's talk about listeners. What has that relationship been like for the listeners? Have you had anybody approach you on the street say, oh my gosh, you're Chris Beaman, you're the host of ISAE's podcast? I'm sure that hasn't actually happened. But what has that relationship to the listeners been like? Have you heard any fun anecdotes from them? How you've inspired them in their career? Chris, I'll start with you.
Yeah, it's funny. I would show up at, ISAE networking breakfasts or, other events, be in the ISAE space, and someone would come up to me and say, "Oh, I heard, your most recent podcast. It was so great, blah, blah." And I would have to ask, which one? Like who was speaking? And so it was really cool that people started to identify some of the same key takeaways and sort of lessons learned that I did from the podcast, and they started to share those with me. It wasn't always in person, but people would comment on LinkedIn and say, this was so great. I would say if I got any feedback the most, people were making more recommendations on, "Hey, I just heard this person speak. We should bring them on." Or have we thought about covering? One of the big ones was Nick did an episode on AI, and I never really revisited it. We did some like future of association technology, but we really never revisited it. And I can count on at least, two hands people that would say to me, "When are you going to bring back AI? Like, this is huge right now, Chris. Come on." And so I would say I would get that feedback more than anything, which told me people were paying attention, and that was really cool.
Yeah, I also appreciate, just quickly, obviously, I know we don't do video with these, but when you asked that question, Chris and I both immediately went, "Oh, no way," that people were like walking up to us on the streets. But I think I can share a lot of the same kind of feedback, right? Of folks starting to say, "Oh, I listened, I got something out of it." Even just in the office today, transparently, right? Like I was like, "Oh, I got to go record kind of our outgoing, goodbye," and somebody saying like, "Yeah, it is a bummer that, right, like it's going to go away because it's been something I've listened to. It's been something I've gotten." And again, even if it's not every episode is something I think that a listener connects with, but I think the ones that have connected for them are valuable. Again, I've got all of them up on my other screen because I am just like re-scrolling through them to be like, I don't even remember, because to Chris's point, again, for a kind of a behind the scenes thing, right? Like we would record several of these in a row, right? So like not necessarily on the same day, if it worked in our schedules, maybe, but right, like we would schedule these, like I would knock them all out in 2 to 3 weeks. And so I think that's the other hard part, is that sometimes, right, there might have been a trend that came up like 2 months later that we'd like, "Ooh, we should do something with that." It might get a little harder to fit in, but to Chris's point, like that's where as a host, we'd be like, "I don't really remember what is the newest one," because I recorded 3 or 4 at a time, and then those would get scheduled in advance, right? And so they'd kind of just get put out there. But I think, yeah, I think there was legitimate listeners in terms of what they were getting from it, and I think looking forward to the next topics and conversations as well.
And I think intentionally, everybody did such a good job of helping make it timeless that you could listen to an episode from 2 years ago and it wasn't talking about the upcoming roundtable event, and that was the only thing that they were talking about. That you could go back, they were evergreen episodes, and you can still go back. And while AI has evolved, certainly in the last 3 years since it was recorded, you can still get stuff from it. You can still go back and have that conversation with the exec from AUSAE and talk about international norms that just as important as it was with the recorded it. And so I think that that's so cool.
And I think that was intentional from the beginning. Like I remember some conversations about that, of like, we need to make sure that we're not, just like you do with like signage at events, right? Like, can I reuse this sign at a future thing? Like, let's not put the brand on it, right? Like, let's just make it a generic pocket sign with our logo, right? Like those kinds of things, I think were something that we wanted to be thinking about. And I would agree, Grant, to your point that, right, the topic might continue to evolve, but I think the conversation that was had around a lot of these topics is still foundational and would give somebody the ability to go back and listen to them at some point. Like I view these as great resources for members at this time.
It's interesting to hear your perspective about the listeners. I'm a big podcast guy. I love listening to podcasts. I have little bandwidth to fit more in, including ISAEs, but I do when I can. And that relationship that a listener has with a host is so intimate. You're in their ears for a long amount of time. It may be an hour commute. It may be at the gym while you're on the treadmill. But in the same thing with radio shows, when you do AM and FM radio, there's a relationship you develop because you're hearing this person in your head and you think you know them more than you actually do. And so I think that that's a really cool thing for you all to get to experience, and to do that, to speak on these episodes and develop a relationship with the listeners. And we would have a great steady drumbeat of downloads every day or every month when they would come out. And so, For the longtime listeners, I'm appreciative for everything that you're doing and continuing to hit the download button because there's a great relationship that's developed for some of those diehard fans. So appreciative of them and certainly appreciative of the relationship that you all developed with them. So I'm sure it wasn't all sunshine and roses. So let's talk maybe about some challenges or maybe funny moments throughout the recording process. Chris, I'll start with you. Is there any challenges that you saw as you transitioned into host or developing scripts? What were some challenges that stood out?
Scheduling was the biggest nightmare. Just trying to make sure we could get time on people's calendar. But one other thing I noticed was when I would approach more seasoned professionals, people who are bringing more years of experience and on paper more expertise to a given topic, I never had a challenge of them saying yes to be on the podcast. I would approach them. We would talk about what they, might discuss, what I was interested in, and they would ultimately say yes. When I approached younger, even more mid-career, early to mid-career people, it was a bit of a challenge. They would say things like, "Well, I'm not sure what I would bring to the podcast," or I'm just a listener. Like, I've been listening to the podcast, Chris. There's no way I could speak on it. And I think the lesson for me, and I think the lesson for associations is we need to figure out how to encourage our early to mid-career professionals to use their voice, to share their perspectives. This is a call to action for all of our young professional committees and councils and task force out there. You have a voice. You bring significant value to your workplaces, to your associations. Use it, right? But I think that's probably the biggest challenge that I personally faced was when I would approach those individuals. I would have to like coerce them into actually being on the podcast.
And we'll push them back to episode 3 where we talked about imposter syndrome.
Which is still the highest number of downloads of the entire podcast. Yep.
Interesting.
Nick, how about you in terms of challenges?
I think, we talked about this a little bit before we got started. I think maybe for me, some of it was a little bit more logistical from the just getting things rolling, right? And I think when we first got started, again, I don't think everyone recognizes how hard and how much work goes into podcasts. I think, again, if you're just a listener, not just to our podcast, but to any podcast, right? Like you listen to a podcast and you're like, this is so easy. All they do is talk for 30 minutes, or an hour. But right, like realistically, there's all the research that goes into that. There's the descriptions, there's the writing, there's the questions, there's the editing on the back end, which again, sounds so simple. But I joked that obviously before we got started, one of the first things I remember happening was the first recording we did it in the same room. And the two of us had very different volume levels when we would speak. And so we learned later in post-editing, right, that was very difficult to manage in terms of raising and lowering volume levels on the recording. And so, right, like, okay, so we're going to switch. We're going to do this a different way. We're going to do it in different spaces. We learned that there was a setting in Zoom that we could record on different audio lines because, again, right, we're not doing these in like recording studios where we have like legitimate sound equipment and I think we've produced a really good product, but right, like at the end of the day, like we're not, a full radio station kind of a thing. And so I think it was a lot of those, but I think as well, eventually the transition from being, and again, I think as an association professional, we're all very familiar with this, but the transition from being very volunteer led to we've got to give some of this to the staff, right? I was getting to a point where I think I remember sitting down at the time with Millie and being like, I do not have time to do all the things that need to be done. So can we figure out who on the staff team can do some of these things and what I can continue to keep doing? And I remember when Rashawn was on staff as well, that we had a conversation at one point. He joked of like, I think I've got my Nick voice down because like at some point I said like, I can't keep creating all the descriptions and I can give you the general topics, but like, can you help write some of the intros and things like that for me? And I'd go in and I'd edit eventually and he'd say, okay, I think I got it this time. Right. And so I think a lot of it was just those logistical pieces. Because to Chris's point, right, you get people on and they were ready to talk, right? They're excited about the work that they're doing. And so those became very just easy conversations to have. But it's a lot of the behind the scenes work, I think, that was the challenge sometimes.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There was a lot of logistical work that went into it that I didn't really anticipate when I said, sure, I'll do that. But another challenge, and Nick, I don't know if you experienced this as well, but interviewing these individuals, the association community is just so kind and so loving and so friendly that I've developed relationships, friendships really with some of the people that I had on the podcast. And I also had people on the podcast who I didn't have that relationship with per se, but that I highly respected. And so there was a bit of like, I'm sort of intimidated by this guest I'm bringing on, but I'm really good friends and, grab a beer with, on this episode. And so maintaining consistency in structure, style, tone, providing sort of a consistent listener experience was a bit of a challenge for me. Bringing someone like Stu Kushner on, someone who, like I said, we grab a beer on Friday afternoon for happy hour versus someone like Sarah Sladek, who is nationally respected, renowned speaker. That was a bit of a challenge to maintain that consistency.
Well, I think it's not even just a consistency, right? But like as the host, I think our part of our role is to make every guest as good as they can be, right? Like I don't want somebody to show up as a guest who maybe was already worried about becoming a guest anyways, right? Back to our like folks being a little apprehensive about joining. Like part of, I think, our job is to help make them shine. And I think to your point, Chris, when I know somebody personally, that was probably a lot easier to do. When I didn't know them as much, right? I'm trying to guide questions or pull things out of what they're saying to still create that feeling, but that could be more difficult. I mean, I do remember, I don't have like a specific one in mind, obviously, but like I can remember getting done with some recordings sometimes and being like, well, I hope that went well, right? Versus some that I would get done and I'd be like, man, that was just an exciting conversation. Like again, going back to a personal, like I feel like I got a lot out of that. So I'm hopeful that that will mean good things for our listeners. And then there were some that I was like, I think that happened. I think it worked. And I guess we'll see, right? Once that recording.
So this is highlighting an interesting point that, the need of a team. So what I'm going to try to pull out is like the larger lessons learned from you all as your times as hosts. But what I'm hearing a lot is like you need that support system. So you need the staff obviously needs to take on a role when any of our associations start a project. Volunteers are awesome and they can do amazing work, but there has to be something that the staff owns. So a huge shout out to all of the ISAE staff, Katie Anderson currently in this role, but all the former ISAE staff who help move this forward, and a shameless plug for Noah Hutton and NTH Productions who does this for us. The editing was certainly a big piece that was a big time suck for so many folks. So this just highlights the importance of that team around you. So what are some other maybe lessons learned that you all had that have helped you in your career? Everything from project planning a little bit better to overcoming maybe some of that imposter syndrome. Chris, I'll start with you. Is there any kind of larger vision that you had from being a podcast host?
That's a great question. I think one of the things, well, two things that come to mind. One, this is going to sound really simple and small, but I had a conversation. I took the time to connect with Noah at an ISAE annual meeting during one of my, during the first part of my hosting. And we just had sort of a casual conversation. And because I got to know him, he shared with me, by the way, if you don't mind, when you have guests who want to restart a section, could you have them use my name so that I can find that in the transcript that I run? And I was like, I never would have thought that. And I don't know that we would have ever gotten to the point where you made that suggestion to me had we not connected in person somehow. And so I think it does go back to the importance of those relationships. We're not going to know exactly how to do everyone else's jobs or perform their roles, but if we share in conversation and really listen to them about the challenges that they have and the opportunities, I think we can, I think we have a lot to learn from one another. And again, it seems so small, but I have to imagine it saved him quite a bit of time listening to these episodes to find those pieces versus just scanning the transcript. Hey, I've got 2 things to edit out. The rest, we're good to go. So that really streamlined it for him. And I think the other one is it speaks to Nick's point that he made. It was always a question in my mind of, I have this question about this topic for this guest, but does everyone else, right? And I didn't know that answer. I didn't have an advisory team that I went to and said, hey, here are the list of questions. What am I missing? it was just between me and the guest, and leaning into their expertise was important, but being able to put aside some of my own biases helped me to prepare that list of questions and that conversation. But it was a significant challenge. But again, I think it goes back to the importance of listening. And I I always think I approach the podcast, and sometimes I approach my work too, in if I were explaining this to my mom, who knows nothing about what I do, is it going to be clear to her if I relay this message, what I'm trying to convey? And so a lot of the questions came from that. Like, if someone has no knowledge or understanding of, let's just talk about meeting planning, for example, are they going to understand if they're in a different role within the association and they want to know more about meeting planning? If what we're covering is too advanced, are we able to still provide a perspective and lens for someone who's not doing the work every day, while also providing some level of advanced technical expertise or thought leadership around the topic? And that was hard, but I think trying to make trying to build messaging that's clear, it builds knowledge, it provides insight, was something that I did carry into my everyday work.
That's cool. Nick, anything for you?
I think for me, and I remember when we did our first transition between Chris and I think we scheduled a couple of calls just to chat, one, again, I think a little bit about logistics, but then also, just generally like what are lessons I've learned. And I think I remember saying that one of the things that I think this really helped to push me into was stronger active listening. Now my team might challenge that still, but I think it has pushed me, right? Because right when I'm surrounded on these recordings with people who are experts on the topic that we've invited them on for, I couldn't just be preparing for the next question, right? Like I needed to listen to what they were saying. And again, if we were really trying to strike this very conversational tone, then that's something that I needed to really be thinking about with them, about what was it they were saying and what might be the new thing. Again, we already had our questions kind of set up, but maybe they're taking us in a new direction now, and I need to bring up that new topic. And so I think that really did challenge me in my everyday profession as well, to just in a one-on-one with a team member, really be thinking about like, okay, I'm not just like thinking about what I'm going to say to them. I want to listen to everything that they're saying. I want to take it in. I want to figure out how I can kind of work on that. The other thing too, and Chris did mention this, is I think this made me a little bit more comfortable, maybe still not all the way there, but a little bit more comfortable with letting projects just start and not having to have every single portion of it figured out. Because I think I was always a person sometimes who very much wanted to just be like, okay, we're going to make it happen and it's going to go and it's going to work. And we've thought of every possible thing that could go wrong. And so now we're going to make this, some of that's the meeting planning background too, of like thinking of a lot of the like what ifs that could happen. But I think this one, again, there were a lot of changes in that very first season that, again, hopefully maybe weren't too jarring for people who were listening, but like we changed questions. We changed the way I approached how to have a conversation. And I think by the time then that Chris took over, I feel like this just had a really strong, it was a well-oiled machine, I think, at that point. And obviously, Chris, as a host, you made it your own and kind of your style. But I think it's my hope that, right, some of that foundational stuff is really what helped that, right? That transition became much easier because of that. But I think if we had said, okay, it didn't get the number of downloads we wanted and we were going to be done with it after the first season, like, I think we knew that we were going to try to make this the long haul, to get to where we wanted.
I love that. Yeah, it's kind of an analogy I've heard of, like riding a bicycle. When you get on a bicycle and you're not pedaling, you try to turn the handlebars, you're just going to fall over. But you actually have to start pedaling. Then you have the ability to use your handlebars to actually then pivot. So the whole point being just start on a project and then you can make the pivots from there. But if you don't start the project at all, or you don't give it enough time, then you're just going to run out. So sounds like you all were able to pull a lot of great lessons from it. So as we look to kind of shift towards the end of this episode, is there any bloopers, funny moments, unexpected things that came out in either the recordings or planning the episodes? Anything you can think of? Anybody just clear their throat awkwardly like I just did on the recording?
Well, it's funny you mention that, because there were several times where I would have to restart a section, and I got more comfortable in some of those bloopers. Like actually just on a recent one, I butchered Stu's intro somehow. I forget exactly what I said. And I was like, I'm just going to leave it. Like, we're just going to roll with it. And I corrected myself. And because, I think people appreciated that that it's real, right? Like these are real conversations. And yes, there is a level of editing, but I would say I can't really think of any funny or blooper moments other than, some of those things. Because quite frankly, honestly, my guests, the guests I got to interview, came really well prepared, like more so than I expected. Like people put a lot of work into. I would send questions, and I mean, some people would detail out actually notes on the document and want to read them verbatim, and I'd have to say, like, again, this is conversational. These were ideas of questions, but so people came really, really well prepared. I would say if anything, bloopers would be just my cat walking in front of the screen. Luckily, we don't do the video. But yeah, what about you, Nick?
Yeah, I think a lot of the same, right? Honestly, I think more of the bloopers were probably on me, right? Trying to read something, or I think it was one of the first times we got a portion of an episode or something sponsored, and I don't remember who, but I had to read the like blurb, right? I probably spent 2 hours trying to record that little blurb because I was like, it needs to sound exciting enough, and I want to do it all in one take, and there were so many times I would get like the very last sentence and I would mess up a word. And I remember at one point, like when I was trying to do some of those like pre-canned recordings, I would like pause and I would scoot back from my computer and I would just be like, this is the most annoying thing. Like it's one sentence. This really shouldn't be this difficult, right? But then I think through, right, like all those, again, just as we think through kind of like how podcasts are done or how video work gets done a lot of the times. And I think through like how we script our members sometimes to be able to say things. And I'm like, and this is why they get nervous sometimes, right? Because they've messed up that word and now they feel like that's flustering them for everything else. And so I don't know. I think that's probably the biggest thing. Like I can just remember being like, and I totally messed that up, right? And so we're going to restart. Back to Chris's comment, we're like, we're just going to restart this section because that was terrible. And I think being more okay with that, because I think at the beginning I was like, crap, I've messed this up. I'm wasting somebody's time because I can't read a sentence that's clearly on a screen as a script for me, right? Later being like, it's okay that I read that question wrong. Or like, I think I remember one time I was asking a question and it took so long to get to the question that eventually at the end of it, I was like, I don't even know what I'm trying to ask you anymore. So I'm sorry, we're going to restart even me asking you the question kind of piece.
Well, I feel that on my debut episode as a podcast host and probably one and only. I've ruined the script already. My dog's running around out here. I've cleared my throat. I don't know what I'm talking about. So I feel all of you. This makes it, but it's fun because it makes it human. We are not Pod Save America and Joe Rogan. We're not these like national top 10 of all time podcasts. It's just some association professionals that are chopping it up. So, while there's a sense of being professional, I love this fact that it's just the association. It's the podcast for the everyday association, which I think is really at the core of it. So final question for you both. Chris, I'll start with you. Do you have any final messages for any of the listeners? Any parting words that you want to give?
I think the two things that I'd like to convey. One is, to ISAE and to listeners, thanks for trusting me with the responsibility to bring on guests and topics and carry on, what Nick is absolutely right. They laid a solid foundation, and I got to take that foundation, and while I might have put my own spin on it, all the logistics were in place. So I didn't have to focus on any of the building. So thanks to ISAE, thanks to whoever ultimately decided to invite me. Grant, I think you had a role in that. Nick, thank you for all of your work to get it established, the YP committee, for brainstorming and ideating it. And the second thing is I would say, I don't know exactly how we're going to do it, but I think it's important that we continue thinking about how we bring about these conversations. I think they're really important. As Nick said, as he did, I learned a lot from every episode. I took away more from every episode. It was a professional conference really on steroids for me because I got to sit and listen to these guests talk about their work, and a lot of it was fascinating, eye-opening. So let's just think about, ways that we can continue that, whether it's on LinkedIn or other platforms. But I don't anticipate the conversation and some of these interviews stopping here, even though this formal structure is being phased out. So thanks again for the opportunity. And yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Nick?
Yeah, I just want to echo, I think, the thank you, right? I think a thank you to the listeners. I don't think we would have kept going 4 seasons, right? If we didn't think that there was at least something there. I think in the kind of the intro, we talked about the number of downloads, the number of episodes that have been done. And I remember at one point when I got to a point where I was looking again at the episode number, and I was like, no way, like that's not what we're at there. That can't be. So I think just thanks to them, right, for the continuation of this. I think again, yeah, a big thanks to the staff team from ISAE. Again, I think that this was a perfect model in my hope of how something can start very volunteer driven. And then as it grows, it becomes staff supported, because I think that's a great model, right? I think as an association professional, we always like to say we're really good at doing those things. And sometimes I think we're not in our own association. And so I think this was a case study almost of like, this is exactly how it can happen, where that control can be given back to the staff. It was completely fine, and I think helped to continue its growth. I think a challenge probably to the association professionals is just to continue to use this as a resource in some way, as we mentioned throughout this, right? This is hopefully some evergreen content, and at least be a starting foundation for some conversations as they continue to evolve in our space. But I think revisit some of those podcasts at some point, like scroll back through the list. Again, like I was starting to look back at some of the ones that Chris and I joked, like I didn't really listen to a lot of the episodes that I recorded because again, it's hard to listen to your own voice sometimes, I think. But like I'm looking back at some of those topics again, I'm like, ooh, maybe I should listen to that topic again. Like it's been 2 years since I had a conversation with somebody about that, and I'd be very intrigued to know like what some of those were. So yeah, I think just revisit, continue to reuse these, and as Chris mentioned, right, like at a future ISE event, right, like bring up topics that are still interesting to you. Like I would love to know. I mean, how we got a lot of topic ideas, right, was from like what I'm reading or like what I'm seeing, and I think it would be just really intriguing to continue to use this as something that we can think about, even not through a formal recording.
Grant, the podcast host in me recognizes that we're really well over the time that we identified for this, but I think there's two other people or two other things I'd like to express gratitude for. One is the guests. As Nick mentioned, we had, I think, in total 56 or something. Yeah, 56 episodes. And each of those guests provided at least an hour or so of their time, if not more, when it came to preparation and helping us spread the word, posting about it on social media. And they did it all pro bono. Every single person that we brought on graciously provided their time and their expertise for no compensation. So huge, huge, huge thank you to each of those guests for that. And the other thing I think we'd be remiss not to share is thanks to the sponsors that did support it during its time. During season 3 and 4, Visit Bloomington stepped up in a big way to financially support the podcast. And I think that it was really important for them to do that because it helped them amplify Indiana talent. And I know that the team there, including Sean, was very proud of that sponsorship. He and I had many conversations about it, and I know they were super excited. So I just want to acknowledge and thank all of those who invested in this work as well. It's truly meaningful for me to have been a part of it, but also to have an opportunity to share these messages and elevate these conversations for what turned out to be a national and somewhat international listenership.
Well, thank you both for the time and expertise. It's been interesting to view this from the executive director chair. This is how you want a project to go. You want to find something that a group of volunteers in a committee are passionate about. You probably need somebody to be voluntold to do it for the first time, which thank you, Nick, for being voluntold. You need to find then what's the right balance of staff and volunteer time. When that initial volunteer needs to transition out, how do you find the next person? And how does that person bring their own passion to it? And then ultimately, what's the right time to pivot and find a different way to focus your resources, staff time and volunteer time? And that's kind of the full circle of what this podcast has been, from a kernel of an idea at a committee meeting once to where we are right now. And the amount of engagement that this podcast has had across our association is really cool to see. And it really is a test case for what you want our associations to do with all of our projects. So thank you, Nick. Thank you, Chris. You have been so impactful to ISAE, to the association community in Indiana, and certainly more internationally. So I appreciate all that you've done for us. And thank you, Nick and Chris, as you mentioned, to Visit Bloomington for sponsoring today's episode in the last 2 seasons. It has been wonderful to have your partnership. We hope that you all enjoyed this episode of You Should Hear This. If this podcast has resonated with you, we encourage you to get involved with ISAE or your respective state association if you're listening from not in Indiana. A shameless plug for all of the state societies out there. ASAE does great work, but so do the local state societies. So please engage with them if you aren't already. We encourage you to get involved with ASAE and other industry-leading organizations, as collectively we all are stronger. Thank you all for your leadership in your associations, and we hope to see you around.